are there lessons here for the continent, Razia? I'm thinking in terms of, if you look at how, to some extent, the South African economy was able to deal with the manufacturing of PPE, and to some extent, the Johnson and Johnson vaccine, there were some experiments rather that took place down there. Are there lessons around Africa investing in the manufacturing sector in the first instance? Secondly, lessons around strengthening Africa's health delivery system. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, on both fronts. So what we've seen in the recent past, if we were to go back in time a bit, and we know that there had been a checkered history of economic growth through the 1970s and 1980s. Things started to improve periodically in the 1990s for the region as a whole. But it wasn't until 2001 thereabouts where we started to see a sustained rise in prospects for most of Africa. And the good news was possibly that in most places, not all, so there were exceptions, of course, important exceptions, but in most of the major economies, we started to see the building blocks for perhaps greater prosperity in the future. The number one requirement is that you're able to sustain growth at a fairly high level for some period of time. And that means investment needs to stay high. So confidence needs to be there to be able to deliver that. But the problem with a lot of the growth that we did see was that it wasn't necessarily sufficiently broad-based. And in a lot of instances, it was all about consumption. So that age-old issue of how do we boost manufacturing sectors? Africa will have the future population, it will have the scale, but will the manufacturing be entirely offshored? Do other locations get such a big competitive advantage that that value addition never comes to Africa, that we never see the benefit of that industrialization? Now, that seems like a very alarming way of looking at it, but what the recent crisis has shown us in a very clear way is that the ability to preserve what manufacturing capacity there is, the ability to build on that future manufacturing capacity, the ability to source all of the inputs that might be needed, including a reliable and reasonably affordable power supply. This is going to be important. We could do a whole hour just on the issues facing African manufacturing. But to answer your question on the healthcare provision issue as well, this is important. At the start of the crisis, there was this realization that given the relatively poor provision of public healthcare in many African countries, we were facing a really big threat. Now, there were some positives as well. The region's recent experience with Ebola, the experience with being able to put new protocols in place very rapidly, populations that were generally compliant with the kind of containment measures that were needed. These were probably strengths, but it's also the case that we can still be doing a lot more to boost healthcare provision across the continent. This is a key requirement for development. We should never fall into the trap of measuring development just in terms of, well, what is GDP doing? You know, is it a technical bounce? Year on year, does this number look better than it did last year? Development is about actual gains. It's about the education that's happening, the quality of that education, the quality of healthcare provision. And we should never, ever lose sight of that it is the quality of what is changing that matters every bit as much as the growth that we might see.
And in addition to that very important point there, Razia, the ability to train and retain talent. I mean, look at you in London out there, and I'm looking at scientists that are working for Pfizer, for AstraZeneca, and that kind of stuff. We've got our scientists, but they are not on the continent.
So hopefully, as an expat here in London, I'm picking up useful skills that I'll one day be able to take home. I would still say there's a bit of a role to be played in that respect. But yes, you hit a very real issue, Trevor. And this is, are we creating the opportunities back in individual economies for the best of the talent that the economies are already generating to be able to attract that back? And it's really been a question of the opportunity. We know everything about Africa's economic potential. The question is, when are we really going to get that center of gravity of economic activity moving back in such a decisive way? There have been bouts of optimism. If you think back to the period just before the global financial crisis, you looked at an economy like Nigeria, lots of so-called repats, Nigerians in the diaspora who were going back home because suddenly the better opportunities were there. When economic growth does pick up, when business conditions do improve, you will see a great deal more of that. So I think it's fairly fluid, but it's clear. If we take a look at the last decade and a half, there has been too much of a stop-go record of economic growth, of opportunity, of improving business prospects. What we need to see is much greater consistency. So more and more skilled Africans are feeling comfortable about that decision, saying, this is the region where I can really see the growth being sustained for a long enough period of time. And I also have a fair amount of confidence that economies are going to be managed in a way where I won't have to worry about my savings being inflated away or being depleted by foreign exchange depreciation. What everyone is looking for is that much more stability, and it needs to be happening region-wide. So the interesting question post-COVID is, how do we build back? We know that there are a few things that are moving in favor of greater regionalization. Finally, the African Free Trade Agreement. The reality is, different signatory countries have 5 years to dismantle 90% of tariff barriers. We know that there are a lot of other factors that impede greater regionalization. The fact that we've got an infrastructure endowment that is much more about taking what is produced and selling it to the rest of the world. The fact that the bigger markets don't necessarily exist in the hinterland. But over time, with the right policies, with the right approach, this can start to change. And that can be a lifting of economic prospects for everyone.